Welcome to the first session of our 2022-2023 HCDG. This year's talk centers around the theme, Legacies of Injustice. And this theme encompasses a broad range of injustices in both the past and the present, which are connected to a complex web of colonial issues. We would like to warmly welcome today's speaker, Dalitso Ruwe. Dalitso holds a joint appointment as an assistant professor of Black political thought in the philosophy and Black studies departments at Queen's University. He's currently working on a manuscript titled Horrors of the Flesh, Black Misandric Violence and the Dehumanizing Logics of Western Sciences, which traces how scientific caricatures between the 7th to the 21st centuries have conscripted Black males as ontologically violent beings and serve as scientific justifications for violent and non-lethal methods to deal with the believed violent nature of Black males. Dalitso's topic today will be on eugenic caricatures of Black male death from the 19th to the 21st centuries. Welcome, Dalitso. The floor is yours.
Thank you so very much to Isabella, Stanley, and Rhea. I am delighted to be here wherever you're at today, listening to this conversation. It's early morning in Toronto for me, so I'm here with my coffee, delighted to be here. So as just been mentioned, I'm working on a manuscript that really traces from the 17th century to the 21st century, the way scientific caricatures have given justifications to the death of Black men. And this particular presentation is based on a publication that just came out in August. So I'll be happy to share that. So I'll give a snapshot about what I was trying to achieve in the paper, give an overview, and hopefully get into some Q&A. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so just an overview of why eugenics. Eugenics is a science that comes about in the 19th century at the ending of Reconstruction. You have medical doctors worried about the ending of slavery. Part of the argument about eugenics was the way in which post the slavery institution and Reconstruction, Black people are moving up north from the South. So doctors are concerned about this because they start to make questions and concerns about the ideas of the ways in which Blackness itself has particular epigenetic phenomena that leads to violence and diseases. So basically in the 19th century, the argument was about why were Black people leaving the slave plantation? So you get different arguments about diseases, right? So to flee slavery was thought to be a disease, right? There was something about slavery that was thought to be a humanizing institution, and therefore any Black person would flee from these institutions was seen to be deranged. This would then matter for the ways in which the ideas of Black males, particularly being rapists, low IQ, would be instrumental to the way in which doctors are influencing policy. So basically the argument about eugenics was that there was something epigenetic about Black men that makes them then be criminals, hypersexual, and have low IQs. All this was around the idea of criminalization. So post-Reconstruction, doctors are making a case that ontologically, right, Black males exist as beings with genes that are prone to create criminality. So doctors are then going to profit different rationale. So what I try to do in this paper is I trace these ideas and show that these ideas are not just relegated to the 19th century, but we can find them in actual autopsies today when we look at the dead Black men who have all sort of been advocating for justice for men that are still with us, right? So basically what I'm saying is that from the 19th century, right, there are caricatures of Black men as epigenetically possessing genes of criminality that have to be lessened. So society is moving with both lethal and non-lethal forms of violence to justify the death of Black men. And I'll give examples of how this is actually operational today, right? So basically, the main thesis in my paper that was published was really to say eugenics, right, legitimizes different forms of violence, whether those are chokeholds, whether it's brutality, and as I'll show, castration and different forms of violence. So basically, the paper really kind of kicks off and was inspired by recent events that happened on May 25th, obviously at the death of George Floyd. I was interested in the very ways in which there were different justifications for George Floyd's death, right? Medical doctors had arguments that it was COVID. It was not the fact that there was a knee on his neck right? There were health disparities, there was everything but the way in which violence that we all saw for 9 minutes as a justification. That intrigued me for reasons in which, again, right, as I've been saying, what is it about the Black male that even when we see forms of violence, right, we tend to say that is not the form or reason for their death. There's something within them, right? So notice that the arguments today were about the ontological existence of George Floyd, not the external violence from society, but there's something in him that required for society to say that is why he died, not the violence that was actually impinged on him. And this was interesting for me because there are ways in which the Democrats, for example, became instrumental in creating a narrative of sacrifice in his life. So in this moment, for example, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says something so flippant, right? Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice. So I'm interested in how does this become an actual point of political conversation? What normal citizen goes out to say, I'm sacrificing my life for democracy, right? And this has to do with the civil rights narrative. Since the death of Emmett Till, the lynching of Emmett Till, right? There's this notion of Black men giving up their lives for democracy. So even in this moment, we see in which Nancy Pelosi makes a claim that George Floyd woke up that day to sacrifice his life for democracy. That should worry us, right? Democracy should protect the citizens to be able to say, you don't have to sacrifice your life. We're not at war, but this notion here presumes that George Floyd's death itself can generate new forms of political attitudes in America, right? And this is not just relegated to George Floyd because it's a global experience. So I'm interested in this moment. How is it that the death of a Black male can be seen as something that rejuvenizes democracy? How have we come to normalize these assumptions, right? Because the converse is to then say, until more Black men die, then we'll get more democracy. Right, that is the inverse of this logic here. So I'm interested in this, right? It's the same argument that Biden made, right? He makes a quip where he juxtaposes the death of Martin Luther King as being lesser than George Floyd. Now, if we remember, Martin Luther King was assassinated, right? So I'm interested in these moments in which historically and even contemporary, Black males are constantly used as linchpins for democracy, their death, right? Not that we should be remorseful and think about how to protect them, but we celebrate their death as something that is a gift to democracy. That should worry us, okay? So what I try to show in this paper is that if we take seriously these notions and claims, right? In a recent study that was published, this is actually interesting because it's this in the age of Obama. In the age of Obama, as a Black male between the ages of 25 and 35, the propensity to likely be killed by the police officers was 2.5 times likelier than any demographic. In a separate paper, I try to show that the very ways in which Obama's presidency was important to the very idea of post-racialism, it also brought up about violence, right? So there was a lot of hate crime that really rose up at the Obama was the president. And I traced the way in which most Black men would be assaulted under the guise of Obama. So you saw hate crimes in which Black men were beaten up because these people would call those Black men Obama. So what I try to show in a separate paper is how this is formulated to the very forms of violence we see. So even when Obama in the death of Trayvon Martin says Trayvon Martin could have been my son, America the last 10 to 8 years has been fascinated with the way in which they can use violence against Black males in one instrument because of Obama. That's a whole different conversation, but empirically we see that in Obama's era, to be a Black male, the probability of being shot by police officers was at 2.5. It was the highest for any demographic in this time period. So my arguments really come about from a field of study called Black male studies. Black male studies was created by Tommy Curry, a philosopher at Edinburgh right now. In the death of Mike Brown, Tommy had published a paper called A Genre of Black Male Death. And in this paper, Tommy was really making a case for the way we must study the caricatures that give rise to the justifications of Black men, or the death of Black men. Tommy's book, The Man Not, an award-winning book, the American National Book won a book prize about the way in which ethnology, the science of ethnology, was constructed to use justification to why lynching Black men was okay. So what I try to do is, building on Tommy's work on ethnology, I use eugenics. So Tommy's making a case that gender theory, as we understand it in academia right now, does not give credence to the forms of violence that happen to Black men, right? So we only think of racism, but we don't think about the sex-specific ways Black men are vulnerable to different forms of violence. In other research, Tommy has shown that Black men have a propensity to be raped. In Toronto, for example, they're the highest sexual assault cases when it comes to police contact with Black men than any other demographic. So Tommy's work is revising how we come to understand violence. And violence doesn't just operate at the level of racism, but that for Black men, there are sex-specific forms of violence, right? And I'll try to show some of those in here. But that notion for Tommy is predicated on what he calls caricatures, right? They're sociological caricatures in which we believe Black men, one, as I'm trying to show in this paper, are epigenetically born criminals. So if we start off with the disposition that Black men are criminals, epigenetically, society sees itself as intruding into the Black male body to dispose of these genes, right? This is the paper that I'm then presenting here. So one of the things I just try to say here, right? Like the idea of violence becomes instrumental post-slavery because now the worry is that Black men are deranged and diseased, right? So if the body politic is supposed to be democratic, those people who are diseased are seen to be Black men, that they possess genes of hypercriminality, they have low IQ that will lead them to then have a lot more violence than any demographic. So society then says, for the safety of society, we must not come in contact with Black males. And how do we do this? We can use both lethal and non-lethal forms of violence to ensure that Black men do not make us a diseased people. So this is very counter to this very notion of the civil rights, right? So remember that I started off talking about the way in which Black men are celebrated in their death as rejuvenated in democracy. In the 19th century, there was a fear that Black men are so diseased. If we allow them to continue to go around in society, they would destroy democracy. Right? So you have doctors then influencing policies about the very ways in which we must formulate different forms of violence. This is important because you start to see the way in which doctors are vying against the mob about lynchings and different forms of violence that should be appropriate. In a separate word, legal scholars have shown how the death penalty became a bargain between middle-class white constitute groups and then lower class people who wanted to use lynching, right? But this is, again, is predicated on the idea that the Black male is a diseased being, and we must do something to protect society, and more specifically, white civilization. Right? So one of the things I try to show in this paper is that in the 20th century, you start to see how doctors, right, become instrumental in arguments about something like non-lethal forms of violence. So in this specific essay, a doctor gets up in front of a conference and practically says, right, one way to deal with these epigenetic phenomena that we see with Black men that leads to them to have lack of moral development or mental development is through vasectomies. So again, the argument here is that Black men possess epigenetic forms of genes that will lead them to be criminals. And what we can then do is to lessen their propensity to pass on those genes by using vasectomies. So we start to see vasectomies being used in Black men under the guise of protecting civilization, because if you allow them to breed, they will create a race of monstrosity, right? So you start to see this, and how he justifies this is, he says, look, I've done this on 5 Black males. So not only is this a theoretical construct, but he's actually saying the Black men who have come to see me, I've encouraged them to take on these vasectomies, right? So he gives an empirical basis of his own arguments to say, this is something that we should take up as a remedy to protect society, okay? Similar in 1910, happens in a mental institution, right? We see the way in which sterilization becomes an appropriate measure, right? We see that 10 Black men were then sterilized under the same notion, right? The argument here was a couple of them were homicidal, a couple of them were so ferocious, sexually ferocious. So what we have to then do is to sterilize them. And this is important because before sterilization and vasectomies became appropriate, in terms of what the American society was thinking to do with people who were deemed to be feeble-minded or possibly possess genes that would impact society, it was Black men who were used as the litmus test, right? So Black men become the litmus test for sterilization and castration as a basis of protecting society against what medical doctors deem to be an epigenetic phenomenon of criminality, okay? This will then influence the very juvenile system, right? So not only is eugenics important, but the ideas of biology. Recapitulation theory was the theory that within the child could be found the development of the race. So we start to see Black boys and juvenile prisons being made, and you see psychiatry being used to say, in the Black boy, we see the very phenomena, the different typologies, right? You can see on this side, the different typologies that exist in the Black male has to be taken out. So the juvenile system starts to say, not only is it Black men, but their sons themselves are then responsible for this. So if we can deal with Black boys at an early age, right, we can then start to lessen the probability of them being capable to be criminals. This will influence the legal system, right? This is a phenomenon that happens in the 1940s all the way to the 1980s in our contemporary moment. It's why Black boys are always hyper incarcerated. It's the idea that within the Black boy, exist the latent forms of criminality, right? The epigenetic phenomena in the 20th century is turned to a recapitulation theory, right? Within the Black boy exists epigenetic phenomena that then have to be taken out. In the 1980s, this will become instrumental to how then the LAPD would then engage with Black men, right? So what happened in the 1980s is that there was an overrepresentation of Black men who died under chokehold by police officers. When they asked the superintendent about why police officers were using chokeholds against Black men, the response given was that, look, in Black men, unlike any other group of people, there's something about their physiology. Their neck is so big that requires superordinate strength. Okay. This is the idea that Sylvia Wynter will come to talk about in terms of no human involved. So in the 1980s, you saw the way in which police officers, after dealing with Black men, they would report this by saying no humans involved. And that was predicated by this very notion that there's something distinct about the Black male physiology, that when one encounters it, that when a police officer trained to either de-escalate or use forms of violence has to use excessive forms of violence. So notice again that there's something within the physiology of the Black male that exists only in the Black male than any other group. So that when the state meets the Black male, the way you engage with the Black male is predicated on the formulations of excessive forms of violence, right? This will drive these arguments. This is a similar thing that was used with Eric Garner, right? Eric Garner's case was a similar incident when he was standing outside in New York. He was accosted by police officers, and the police officer choked him and basically said, right, I don't care about you not being able to breathe. But what was interesting in that particular moment, when you look at his autopsy, is the medical coroner says it was not asphyxiation as the cause of death, right? So in spite of the very way since the 1980s, Black men have been overrepresented in police contacts and death, right? In the death of Eric Garner in 2014, these arguments start to then turn to say there's something again within the physiology of the Black men. Just the same way in the 1980s, right? The argument was that the Black male has a superordinate body, that their necks are so big that you need excessive forms of violence to bring them down. It's the same argument in 2014 used against Eric Garner, that it's not the chokehold. It is something to do with his own physiology, okay? And when you examine the autopsy again, what becomes interesting is you see the arguments here is that, look, it's an enlarged heart he had. He had chronic asthma and he was obese. So the death here is counted to be something about his physiology, and there's something internal, right? That when you excavate the actual cadaver of the dead Black male, there's something within the Black male that triggers their death, that death is exacerbated by them ontologically and not societal violence. So the argument here is then to say the chokehold was not what actually killed him, but it's the fact that he had chronic asthma. So when he says, I can't breathe, it's not him being suffocated, but that that asthma kicks in, or that his heart that was too enlarged and he was so obese. Why this mattered is because one of the medical professionals says a similar thing. It says, look, Eric Garner was so obese, right? He overweight 350 pounds. That is not normal, typical for a normal person. So basically the chokehold, right, was not even enough to bring him down. So notice, despite us watching the viral moment going viral and being aggrieved, right? When the Black male's body is in front of a medical coroner, it is not societal violence, right? It is something about the way the body is structured. The Black male body itself possesses the nihilistic probability of coming to death, right? The way in which police and the state is absorbed of the forms of violence by pointing to the very physiological things within the Black male, right? This is the carryover from the 19th century I'm trying to point to, is that the way in which the Black male is conscripted says that there's something internal, right? It is the way his heart is. He's over obese, he's eating too much, he has unhealthy lifestyles. These are the things that bring death. So by the time the police encounter the Black male, it is not that violence, it's that the Black male himself has always been violent with his own structure that then leads to his death. And this was, again, a similar argument just made by another doctor, right, saying the same thing, right? It was not the arresting officer's actions, it was the Eric Garner, right? It is all these things within Eric Garner that produce asphyxiation and not the actual form of constriction against his neck, right? Why that is interesting, again, in New York, you see that there's an overrepresentation of Black males when it comes to chokeholds, right? So since the 1980s, 2014, right, Black men, the way in which police officers engage in bringing Black men down is through chokeholds, right? So we see that there's a particular phenomena encouraged that particularly says that a Black male, despite of their body mass or how tall they weigh, right, you have to use excessive form of violence to bring them down because there's something about them that is not human. Okay? This man is in the same capacity. When you look at the autopsy of George Floyd, it was the same thing. All right. Despite us seeing the video of the knee being placed on his neck, the argument from the coroner was that, look, when you actually look at his neck, there are no lacerations, right? There's nothing around the way his neck was positioned. His skull was okay. Everything was okay with George Floyd. It was clearly not the neck that killed him. It was not the knee that killed him, right? Again, much like Eric Garner, you see that what they start to point to are natural diseases, right? Hypertension. There's something in there. There's a clinical history of hypertension, right? There's a tumor in his lower pelvis. So notice again, right? Like, it is not the argument that he was pinned down for 9 minutes and had a knee on his neck. There's something internal about the Black male that is the self-triggers death, right? And this is what I mean about epigenetic phenomena, right? Much like in the 19th century when there was this idea of feeble-mindedness, low IQ, and the need to take measures like castrations and vasectomies. In a similar argument, the argument is that societal violence is not what brings about the death of George Floyd and Eric Garner and other Black males, right? So this becomes important in terms of how autopsies are used. And even more significant is the way they test so much for drugs. Notice that for George Floyd, they tested for 5 different drugs to justify that it was not the chokehold. So again, the presumption here, right, is that Black men are just walking around out here overdosing with different drugs in their system, right? In other words, it actually justifies why you should be killed, because the argument here is that the Black man is so decrepit, nihilistic, and is engaging in all these forms of recreational drugs that are not appropriate. So the time a police officer accounts them or coasts them, these things are justified in terms of the violence used against them because you got all these overdoses. The only thing that was positive in here was the caffeine he took, okay? So this becomes again important to the justification for why George Floyd should have been killed by the police, right? A similar argument here was made by Elijah McClain. Elijah McClain is interesting, much like George Floyd. I think in the UK, it's called acute syndrome. In the US and Canada, it's called excited delirium. Excited delirium is basically a phenomenon that happened in the 1980s. It is not a real phenomenon, but medical coroners were saying that there's an overrepresentation of Black men who are overdosing from cocaine. And when police officers find them, they have to use excessive forms of violence, right? Elijah McClain was said to have exuded superordinate strength, right? So much so that they required that he has to be brought down with syrup that is used for bringing down horses. So again, much like the way in which Eric Garner, George Floyd were seen to possess things internally, Elijah McClain was seen to have excessive force, excessive strength that needed serum for a horse to bring him down, right? Again, it is not the ways in which we think of Black men as human, but we have to possess different forms like using serum for an animal to bring down a human being, right? This was used to say, you know, he was so strong that 3 police officers couldn't bring him down. And Elijah McClain was walking home. He had his headphones after work, walking home. Somebody called the police on him, thinking he was a burglar. He was a shy young man. I think he weighed about 150 and was brought down by 3 police officers. They choked him and put syrup in his body. Excuse me, sorry. A similar incident happened with Mike Brown. Mike Brown was shot down in Ferguson when the police officer went to court and was asked about his experience with Mike Brown. He described Mike Brown as a demon, right? There was something latent in Mike Brown that required him to be shot. Now, I'm pretty sure we all watch sci-fi movies, right? When we think of demons and aliens, we think about exercising things. All right, so even in this moment, right, an 18-year-old Black boy does not become just an innocent 18-year-old Black boy or somebody the police has accosted. It's that he becomes a demon, right, in this moment. And this isn't a grand jury, right? So imagine that this is a transcript that will live on forever in the records of legal history. The testimony given by the officer is that the boy turned into a demon. He was granting, had superordinate strength. Right. So again, within the Black male is seen to be latent forms of criminality and animality and demons. So much so that when violence is used against them, a police officer can go to a court and in the testimony justify his actions by saying he turned into a demon. right? And that can become plausible argumentation and justification for the violence, okay? So as you can see here, right, the demon becomes balking. So even after shooting Mike Brown, the argument is not that the boy was recoiling, that he had a moment in which he's experiencing pain, but the bullets actually make him bulk up. All right, so again, right, it's the idea of transmorphication. The Black man becomes a superordinate being, all right, so that you're exercising violence has to be so excessive to bring down the Black male. All right, there's a latent form of criminality that exists in the Black male that has to have excessive forms of violence, which is why I'm saying, much like sci-fi, when we watch sci-fi, the inability for humans to have particular forms of technology requires them to use superordinate technology to bring down aliens, right? Well, that is sci-fi. This is the reality for Black men when they're accosted by police officers. Police officers believe you have to have excessive form of violence to bring down a Black male. And again, what was interesting in terms of Mike Brown, when you look at his autopsy, I think I can't count right off the top of my head, but I'm going to say these are more than 10 drugs tested for him. So much like George Floyd, Eric Garner, notice that the autopsies always have a propensity to test for drugs. Now, just imagine this. This is an 18-year-old kid coming from school, right? You're tasting for more than 10 drugs in an 18-year-old coming from school. What does that say about the belief we have about Black males? That even when you're going to school and you're going to go to a convenience store, the first argument that the doctor may have, the coroner may have, is that you were probably on drugs, that you had 10 different drugs in you, and the only drug that was in him was weed. But in spite of that, right, you had to test for excessive forms of way in which he was engaging in recreational drugs, right? So you start to see how even an argument about him being a demon can be justified by thinking through the different drugs in him that exacerbated him to be a demon, right? So even in his death, right, this becomes instrumental. They're testing for even alcohol, all right? All the different forms of drugs that the thing are in the Black male. Similar incident will happen with Ahmaud Arbery, right? Ahmaud Arbery, in terms of why the DA thought that it was okay for the violence that happened, was that there was something about his mental history that he possessed an aggressive nature, right? So much so that the argument made by the DA was that he was actually suicidal. So the time he gets shot, they're basically making an argument that because he had this aggressive nature in him, he went off to induce violence against himself so he could be killed. So even despite the fact that we see these men are corralling him, being harassed by 3 grown men, coming out their car and shooting him, right? The argument here is that the Black boy, Ahmaud Arbery, was so suicidal, but he woke up and was jogging just to create a suicidal incident for him. And this is what I mean when I say, right, the justification society gives makes the violence we use against Black men benign. But there's something internal about the Black male, right, that requires that we use these forms of violence because there's something internal, right? So the justification here is not the violence, but that's an internal thing about the Black male that then was the cause for death, okay? Now, what I also try to show in the paper is that this is not just something that's used by medical coroners or police officers. When you look at the manifestos from mass shooters, Black men and the caricatures of Black men as eugenic caricatures is always present, right? This is the boy, Dylan Rufus, shot 9 people in Charlestown. When you read his manifesto, his arguments about his manifesto are exactly the idea that Black men are stupid and violent. And you can know that because they have high low Q that leads to high testosterone and low impulses. This is a 19th century argument that was used by doctors to why Black men should be sterilized and vasectomy should be used. This is within our millennium in which a young white male makes an argument for mass shooting based on the ideas that Black men have low IQ, low impulse, and high testosterone, and therefore are a threat to society, right? As he ends, right, these are 3 recipes for violent behavior. So much like the diagnosis used to encourage violence against Black men through doctors in the 19th century and 20th century, here within our millennium in mass shootings, we see how those arguments become justifications to carry on mass shootings. A similar argument was made by another mass shooter, right? He makes a similar argument. The Black man is the most vile creature on the planet. Notice that the argument here is, again, right, the Black male is a creature, a vile one. No different from the argument made by Darren Wilson about why he shot Mike Brown. He was a demon. Here is a mass shooter saying a similar argument, right? That the Black man is only concerned about his penis. This is the same argument used by doctors. Castration should be used, right? Notice that the argument here is castration and elimination. This is a similar argument from what doctors were saying. And this is a justification given today about carrying on mass shootings. So we see that Black men exist as the very triggers for violence in society, right? That when we're thinking through mass shootings, police violence, and even coroners justifying Black male death, that they're arguing that there's something within the Black male. So another way to say this is that since the 20th century, 19th century, right, the Black men exist as something that has to be dealt with, that there's something internal, that we need new forms of violence at all levels, right? What I'm showing is that we've used sterilization, castrations, chokeholds, and now we have mass shootings, right? Different formulations of why violence is appropriate, right? The Black man exists as a diseased being that has to be castrated and eliminated, okay? And so I think the ending of this was just to say, I mean, the UN has been trying to employ everybody to take on the way we can deal with these things at the legal phenomena. But what Black male studies is trying to show is that we have a very tried and true notion in which we think and believe of Black men as non-humans, or as Tommy Curry would say, as man not, right? The very justifications we have about the death of Black men are always operational at this notion of having epigenetic caricatures, that there is something ontologically about the Black male, that he exists as a viral being that has to be killed, and we can use different formulations of violence and justifications for that. I think that concludes this portion of my presentation.